Welcome to another episode of Making Sense with Carl. I'm Carl Leibowitz. Today we're talking about cannabis. Our guest today is Jeremy Berke. He's a journalist, writer, and founder of Cultivated Media, which is a website that covers cannabis from a business and policy standpoint. Jeremy was a senior reporter at Business Insider, where he covered and got into the weeds of cannabis. He holds an MBA from Columbia Business School and has earned a graduate level certificate in cannabis pharmacology from the University of Vermont, where he was a cannabis media fellow. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Carl. That intro probably made me sound a little smarter than I am, but I'm excited to be here, excited to chat all things cannabis.
So it is a great place when I look at it to get all my information on cannabis and weed. And I just want to know, why did you decide to start Cultivated?
Yeah, I think it was two things. And number one is I left my full-time job at Business Insider. I had really done something intrapreneurial at Business Insider, where I had pitched and launched a vertical covering the cannabis industry. And we were, at the time, one of the first mainstream financial publications to do so, to really treat cannabis not as a sideshow, but as a multi-billion-dollar consumer product that it is today. When I left BI, I had started my MBA at Columbia, and I had a lot of story ideas, that I still wanted to write. And so I was doing the kind of Substack thing, and I had a nice little list of readers that followed me over from BI. While I was in business school, I had a who started as a source, then became a friend within the cannabis industry, who had started cannabis media properties before. He was looking at my Substack and saying, hey, this is good, but if we move to a daily model, we can really build a real business out of it. I hemmed and hawed a little bit. I wasn't really sure I had the, metabolism to do a daily newsletter while I was in graduate school. But then again, I agreed. My business partner, Jay, made a very good case for it. And we started it. And, the real reason and the real thing we saw was a gap that, professionals in the cannabis industry, whether it's lawyers, people that work at cannabis tech firms, founders, policymakers, there was no real serious coverage for them that was embedded within the industry, right? And I think that's the gap we fill. And, we're growing really well. And so we think that it was a good idea. We launched the daily newsletter in November of 2023, and we're going strong.
Yeah, when you look at like legacy media, you notice that they don't cover cannabis in the same way that you cover it. You notice
Yeah,
it's
they
one
definitely
thing around.
don't. No, I mean, look, I don't want to, be sort of egotistical in my coverage, right? I think it's a question of resources and a question of readership, right? Just recently, Politico had a, very robust cannabis industry team with two reporters and an editor. Those two reporters and that editor have been reassigned. In Canada, when Canada legalized cannabis in 2018, every major newspaper had a vertical covering the industry with dedicated reporters covering the space. Many of those are no longer. It's less new in Canada, of course, and it's sort of just become a more staid industry, right? Like many other, but absolutely not. I mean, to answer the question succinctly, a lot of the journalism that I see from mainstream publications, while it's good, it sort of parachutes in, right? They don't have a full understanding of the consumer issues, a full understanding of the very complex regulation and policy that governs the industry, given the fact that it's legal at the state level, illegal at the federal level, all these banking issues. Like, it's a very, very complex beat, and it's very hard to cover well. All the while, almost 500,000 people are employed in the industry, right? And so they want to read stuff that's relevant to them, that's embedded within their industry. And we feel we provide that in a much more robust way than most mainstream publications do.
How do you decide what to cover? If I would go into Google News and type in cannabis, there's a lot of stuff that comes out. So
Yeah.
how do you decide every day?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Some days it's like drinking from a fire hose, right? And other days, there's not much to cover. And so you can sort of think a little bit longer term. I would say two things. One is, we really want to be extremely reader focused. So, our readers are operators in the industry, people employed in the industry. So it's what's going to help them do their jobs, right? There's a million things that are interesting to me as a writer and as a reporter, but what's really going to help our reader understand what's going on, how to think about things, make them sound smarter in meetings to their boss or their employees or whoever it may be. So that's the number one thing. And I would say that really boils down to, look, like, cannabis is an emerging industry, right? And all the emerging industry problems associated with it in terms of how these companies are growing, labor practices, banking issues, like I mentioned. And it's so intertwined with policy. And so I think our sweet spot is a little bit how policy changes will affect businesses today and how businesses are reacting to those changes. Because a lot of our readers know that their competitors are reading the same newsletter, right? And so they want to understand how their competitors are thinking about things, how they should be thinking about things, as well as what's coming down the pipeline, whether new states are looking to legalize, the debates that are happening in state houses all across the country. All the above is interesting, but I'd say that sweet spot is, how do we help our readers do their jobs more effectively?
JAMA Internal Medicine publication
Mhm.
said between 2021 and 2023, cannabis amongst Americans 65 and older went up to 46%. Are you looking at that audience as readers for you guys, or is that not what you guys are looking at?
Yes. I mean, in terms of, we certainly want everyone who's interested in the industry to read us, right? So that means consumers. Cannabis use, as you mentioned, is rising very rapidly among seniors for sleep and many other health related reasons, health and wellness related reasons. I would say though, our core readership is really people in the industry itself, right? We want to make sure that we're reaching the people that are running companies, that are, heading up at a law firm, the practice area for this industry group, right? We want people that are really in the industry itself. That being said, of course, we'll cover consumer issues. We cover a lot of interesting research and science and research about, the therapeutic promise of different chemical compounds of the cannabis plant. But our bread and butter is really, people in the industry itself. And especially, I would say, from the media business perspective, we really want to reach people who have P&L control at their companies, right? Because our advertisers want to know that these are the decision makers of the cannabis industry and that they can reach them in a very targeted way.
I'm on your newsletter, so I get it every day. I look at it and I walk away with a better understanding of like where we are. If you're trying to figure out like what's going on in, California, what's going on in New York, what's going on in
Right.
Ohio, there's different places and you have it all covered there.
Yeah. I mean, look, like I think from a journalist perspective, I mean, sort of taking a step back from the business model, right? The market is so fragmented. The rules in New York are completely different than California. Cannabis, the raw material cannot cross state lines. So each state, in essence, is really its own market, right? And there's not a lot of continuity across these. So, Minnesota just recently last week started its legal cannabis sales. And so if you're sitting in New York and you want to learn about what's going on in Minnesota, there's no really way to figure out about that without reading local newspapers in Minnesota about a dispensary opening, right? And so we thought that given how fragmented the market is, the sort of daily edition helps give a roundup of what's going on, what's happening, and just making sure that we're paying attention to each market. Obviously, we have a pretty small team. We can't cover every single thing every single day, but we can curate what we find will be important to our readers, right? And so it's very, very challenging to do that because each state has its own issues, has its own policy, and also has its own intended consequences of what they want to use legalization for. And I think that's a very interesting change, right? One example I'll just bring into that quickly is New York legalized in 2021. Joe Biden was president. The George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter protests had just sort of rocked America at that time. And New York's cannabis legalization policy is a reflection of that. It was specifically designed to repair the harms of the war on drugs, to create opportunity for minority entrepreneurs, whereas California came way before that. And California legalized in 2016. And California really wanted to, well, they certainly cared about those goals, right? They really wanted to create a new industry and say, everyone knows what Cali bud is, Cali weed. And so they wanted to sort of bring that into the legal fold as a consumer product. The third example of that, I would say, is Oklahoma. It's a medical state, not a legal recreational state. Recreational being just, any adult can buy it. But they really went for a free market, red state Oklahoma approach where they let everyone have a license who could possibly have it, created very few rules and regulations around it, and didn't pay too much attention to the social equity goals that they paid attention to in New York. And so all that is to say is all these states are so different and the effects on consumers, businesses, regulators is all very, very different. And so we try and compile all that information to the best of our.
Is that program working? Because I think they do it in Arizona too, right? The repair program, or is it not really?
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, I don't want to say these programs haven't worked. They've certainly been challenging, especially in New York, right? I mean, there's just so many issues around the way New York has designed its cannabis policy that doesn't really, it's a really nice idea, but the practicality of it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And so, in New York, basically, one of the key issues is that it's very, very hard social equity entrepreneurs. These are specific classes of licenses that were licensed to sell cannabis that were given to people who had some sort of harm from the war on drugs, whether they're in a zip code that had a lot of arrests, or they have a family member who was arrested themselves, or they themselves, serve time for a cannabis-related offense. There's very few real estate available for them to open their stores. In order to open a store and actually get a license, they have to have the real estate locked down first. And so they're paying these very expensive leases, going through all this bureaucratic red tape just to get open. And so often they are in the red even before they make their first sale. And so, well, these are very nice ideas. It's very challenging to pull.
Ohio just made $2 billion in sale. I just read
Yeah.
that on your site. But the tax laws are very complicated, and a lot of these companies aren't
Yes.
making a profit.
No.
So,
Yeah. And I laugh because it's not only not a lot of these companies aren't making a profit, a lot of them took a lot of debt in order to make no profits, right? And so you can see that equation doesn't really make a lot of sense. Look, I think, we see these big headline numbers, and I think when you look outside the industry, you see, Ohio sold 2 billion, New York has sold well over $1 billion of legal cannabis in the last year, right? I mean, these are big headline numbers and big markets. However, thanks to the conflict between state law and federal law, there are severe tax issues, severe banking issues that these companies must contend with that really eats into their margin. So, for example, cannabis in the US federally is a Schedule 1 drug of the Controlled Substances Act. It's been classified like that since the Nixon administration. And that means that the federal government deems it to have a high addictive potential and no medical uses. We know at the state level that that's false, right? That there's plenty of medical uses, that, you know, there's people certainly may have use problems with it in the same way as gambling, but it's not addictive in the same way that harder drugs are addictive chemically in your brain. The result of that is there's a tax code. I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. Bear with me. There's a tax code called IRS Code 280E that says that no cannabis company, no company selling a Schedule 1 drug can deduct any of the regular business expenses from their tax bill. And so that means that cannabis companies are paying, some of them, upwards of 70% tax on their business. Meanwhile, economies of scale, in terms of the way economics works, wholesale prices are declining. And so they're contending with 70% tax rates, as well as the price of the material, cannabis as a commodity, is declining. And so you can see that it's a very, very hard business to operate, despite the fact that we get all these headlines about $1 billion sales, $3 billion sales, whatever it may be.
the way forward is for the federal government to change it from a Schedule 1 drug. Where's the federal government on that?
Look, if I had a crystal ball, I think I would probably start a hedge fund and not be a journalist, right? And I would get this all right and make a lot of money on deciding what the federal government would do. I don't know. I will tell you that President Trump on the campaign trail spoke in favor of rescheduling, meaning moving cannabis from Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act to Schedule 3, which is a lot less restrictive. Still would be a restricted controlled substance, but it would get rid of the 280E tax, and it would certainly normalize the industry in the eyes of federally chartered banks. It would allow cannabis industry employees to do things like get mortgages, which they still have trouble doing even in 2025, open lines of credit, checking accounts, like all the boilerplate stuff of commercial banking. It would really open that up. Trump spoke about it last October. He has gone nowhere, in the 8 months he's been president. He made some positive comments about a month and a half ago in August saying, it's something we're looking at, we're going to decide. But the process really to reschedule was started by the Department of Justice under President Biden. It ended up getting stonewalled by the DEA. That's really what happened. They were supposed to be a series of hearings in January. There was a lot of lawsuits and counter lawsuits about who could be a witness, who could say what, and the whole process kind of ground to a halt. And so it's really waiting for the federal government, whether that's Trump himself, the attorney general, or even the new head of the DEA, to restart the process. And so we're in a little bit of a waiting period for federal reform right now.
If you own a cannabis store, could you sell like groceries too, and then you could deduct that part of the business? Is this going on at the moment or not really?
You can't. No, if you are a licensed cannabis shop, it's pretty specific. I
Can
mean, it does differ state by state a little bit, and I want to be clear about that. But it's pretty clear. It's like you are a liquor store, you sell cannabis, you can sell swag, right? Like you can sell
yeah.
T-shirts, you can sell rolling papers and the things, lighters, like whatever it may be, right? But at the end of the day, the biggest source of your cost is going to be your core product, right? And so even if you can deduct T-shirt sales, from your balance sheet, it's not really going to make a
No.
huge impact in the way you're tax planning. That being said, like it's a pretty good idea. There are some bodega sellers in New York City that want to be able to do that. They want to be able to add cannabis sales into bodegas. And I would certainly, encourage everyone to talk to their lawyer before they do that. But like that could be a pretty creative way to get the tax bill a little bit lower for sure.
So the other question that I have is who's regulating cannabis right now? If I go get amoxicillin in California and I get amoxicillin here in New York, it's the same. And who regulates all this?
In the US, there are no coherent federal regulations for cannabis. The FDA does not, the FDA has done some work on trying to come up with good regulations, but the FDA is not overseeing all the states in terms of how they're delivering products to consumers, the supply chain. Like they are not doing it in the same way they are doing it for any other drug or consumer product that you can buy in a store. It's a pretty unique scenario. Each state has its own regulatory body that sets its own rules for things like potency testing, like how much THC is in a product, for the proper amount of pesticide to use to grow the product, what the labels can claim or not claim about, whether the cannabis can help you sleep or focus or whatever marketing claim they want to make on the label. And so it's a pretty bizarrely regulated space. And I don't say that lightly just because it's so patchwork state to state to state. Even on top of that, each state has its own regime for testing, as I mentioned, in terms of potency testing. And there are a lot of problems with these. These are private market actors. They're not sort of publicly run or publicly regulated, state run, state regulated. And there are a lot of problems. A lot of them have a business incentive to pass cannabis samples that maybe did cross the threshold for pesticide or were more potent or less potent than the label claims. And consumers are buying these products thinking that they are regulated in the same way the FDA regulates a product. They very much are not. Yeah.
With medicine in 40 of the states, it's legal, but 24, I think, are the states has recreational use. So that means 16 of those states use it just for medicinal purposes. Is medicinal and recreational different by state, or?
It is. Some states say that if you are a medical cannabis provider, you can only sell into the medical market. You can only sell to medical consumers who have a card and went to a doctor and got a prescription. Other states, like Minnesota, for example, Minnesota dispensaries can co-locate medical sales and general consumer sales in the same store itself. And so look, like there really is not a huge difference between these products. And I want to sort of be careful with what I say because there's many people in the industry who will disagree with me. They're not regulated like Tylenol. And take that a step further, it's certainly not regulated like an antibiotic or something that you need a prescription for, right? Like these really are sort of raw material products. They're tested, and they have very specific medical use cases. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that these aren't pharmaceutical drugs in the same way that you might think of any other pharmaceutical drug, excuse me. And, I think many medical cannabis companies are moving in that direction. I mean, they're trying to isolate the specific compound that, they can understand through clinical trials and science and research has a causative effect on a certain ailment, right? Like they're trying to do that. But cannabis is different. And so, many medical cannabis consumers are simply buying the gummies that you or I might buy at the store. It's just marketed a little bit differently, but it's very much the same product in many ways. The other thing that some medical states do allow higher potency products for medical users, just based on the fact that, more THC or CBD, the compounds in the cannabis plant, can have a broader effect on pain relief than what's allowed under the consumer recreational regulation. So there is that difference, but by and large, they're very similar products, some marketed quite differently.
Yeah, I did work with a company out of Germany on cannabis, and they were trying to get into the market, the 65 plus. And one
Hmm.
of their issues that they were always having is that dementia patients, they said, would be much calmer once they took the cannabis. And they were trying to get it to them, but they had a lot of trust issues
Hmm.
with the family, some of the family member of getting that to them because of the regulation. And I always thought that was really interesting. It's helping these patients, it's helping dementia patients, but how do you get it there? And how do you get it regulated that they're not taking, it's not different from state to state?
Right. Yeah. I think, Carl, you bring up a really interesting issue, right? And something that I touch on in my reporting all the time is that stigmas die hard, right? And cultural change is very hard. And with cannabis in particular, it's very, very difficult. There are older generations who just think drugs are bad. Weed is a boogeyman. Like, this is sort of rooted in the 1960s, right? And it doesn't change. They think it's for people who are deadbeats, burnouts, losers, whatever it may be. And while they may not say that to you or I, when confronted with using it themselves for some therapeutic benefit, or their family member using it themselves for a therapeutic benefit, it becomes very, very hard to change that mindset and to get around that gap. That's part of what my work is, my reporting is trying to take this seriously. And what we do at Cultivated is trying to take this seriously. But it's very hard to change hearts and minds like that. I think secondarily, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that these things work, right? For dementia patients, for chemotherapy patients, who are having trouble eating, for other, mental health reasons, right? Like, I can tell you, cannabis does help me sleep better. Sometimes I struggle falling asleep, and if I eat a gummy, I'll sleep through the night. It'll be great, right? But turning that anecdotal evidence into a clinical trial, right, is a much higher burden, right? And so I do think some people are wary that, these products have not gone through FDA approved clinical trials, and they're worried about what it's like to give a drug to an older person. And I think I'm very respectful of that claim, right? At the same time, we're sitting here in September 2025, do have a lot more of the evidence that these things work than we did in September 2018, just because regulations have changed and made that research a lot easier to do. And so, while it's not perfect, we do have a lot more evidence. But at the end of the day, it is weed. It's a drug. People have their thoughts, feelings, and opinions about it. And the last thing I'll say on that is it's even reflected in the regulations that relatively progressive states like New York write about their cannabis laws. uh, you know, cannabis is treated like plutonium in a lot of dispensaries, right? Like, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't see the product through the window. Meanwhile, you can go to a liquor store and there's giant ads, and you can open the bottle in the store if you want and drink it. Like, no one would stop you, right? And so
Yeah.
it is a very interesting idea that the stigma and the social thought around cannabis is so rooted in how we think of it as medicine, how we think of it as a legal issue, regulatory issue, and consumer issue as well.
Yeah. I have a friend who had a son who was going through chemo, and they had to keep his weight up. And one of the ways to do it was
Yeah.
with cannabis, and it helped. He keep his food down, and he said it really helped getting him through the chemo.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I might be a little bit biased. I report on this stuff every single day. Like, I think we're really just scratching the surface about all the potential that this plant does have, all the compounds within the plant to, on so many different things, right? So many different physical ailments, mental illnesses, dementia, anorexia. Like, there's all these things, all these very compelling evidence that cannabis can help with all these issues. Especially because the drug or the plant has been so understudied for the past few decades compared to any other plant, just because it is on that Schedule 1 registry by the federal government. And so rescheduling, if that's something President Trump does decide he wants to do or his administration wants to do, will unlock much more of the research and make sure that it's much more robust in a way that, it's not quite yet today, even though the evidence is very, very compelling.
Yeah, and we talk about the THC beverage market because that's generating $1 billion in revenue. And there's so many different bands. What is this drink? Like, I was
Yeah.
just
So
looking at it, and I was like,
you
"What
asked a
is
really
it?"
good question. So I'll try again. This is like super complex policy stuff. I'm going to boil it down as simply as I can. In 2018, the Farm Bill, which is a general agricultural stimulus bill that gets passed every so often in Congress, it specifically allowed the production of hemp for agriculture. Hemp and cannabis are the exact same thing. The Farm Bill legally defined hemp as containing less than 0.3% THC. THC is the chief psychoactive compound of the cannabis plant. For all intents and purposes, it's the same exact plant, same exact drug, just grown differently. Many, many businesses have figured out that they could take a hemp plant with 0.3% THC and basically produce regular THC in much higher quantities from that raw material. And they can put it into things like beverages, like gummies, like edibles. And so they're basically using what some might call a loophole in the 2018 Farm Bill to just sell drinks containing THC in all 50 states outside of the state by state regulated dispensary system. So you see these drinks, they do have THC, maybe 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams on a higher dose. And you can see them in grocery stores. You can see them in bodegas in New York. Texas just went through a whole issue of trying to ban them. The lawmakers were not able to ban them. And so it's been this sort of back door into
And I get it.
legalization.
Can I get
Yes,
it in the grocery store? Like, if I went downstairs to my local ShopRite, would it be there?
it depends on what store you're in. By and large, I see them in a lot of big chain stores, right? And I'm not exactly sure if those who are stocking the shelves are really aware of, all the complicated regulations around this, the Farm Bill, the hemp cannabis dichotomy. I don't know, but they see these products and people love them. They sell, and they're a really good entry point, for people who want to experiment with cannabis, might not be willing to, go to a dispensary, go through that whole rigmarole and burn and smoke a joint. They might be able to crack open, a can of grape soda with a little bit of THC in it that they bought at Total Wine or something like
Have
that,
you
right?
tried have you tried this drink? Does it do anything? Because it
Yeah,
sounds like it does very little.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm a
Not being
regular
putting you on the
consumer.
spot, if you're like, "Sorry if I
No, no,
put it."
no, no. I'll say this. Like, I'm a regular consumer. I think I'm open to saying that. My tolerance is a little
Okay,
bit higher than I think,
okay,
these products are really going after. But look, like, for my mother, let's say who's in her 60s and doesn't use cannabis very often, like it'll work and she'll get a really good night of sleep if she wants to
okay,
try it. And
good.
she doesn't have to go into a dispensary and go behind the frosted glass and show her ID and pick from a menu of products she doesn't understand. She can say, "Oh, I want to try that, grape seltzer with 5 milligrams of THC," and get it at,
Then she'll fall asleep, got it.
and then she'll fall asleep, right?
My other question is there a difference between smoking it and taking a gummy? Because I would think that if you smoke it, you're supposed it self-regulates, right? I think the gummies, you're taking it and then you take too many of them, you can go on a bigger ride than you were expecting to go.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a difference between gummies and smoking for a number of different reasons, right? One is how THC is metabolized, and so it's metabolized very differently if you take a gummy and versus smoking it. And so when you take a gummy, you often won't feel the effects for an hour or 2 hours later. Some people don't wait and they take too much, right? Because they're like, oh, this thing isn't working, and they don't realize that the effects are going to hit them like a brick wall in a couple hours. Number two is that when you smoke, you're not just ingesting THC, which is the chief psychoactive component. Again, you're ingesting all these other cannabinoids, the chemicals in the cannabis plant, CBD, CBN, these rare compounds that show up in smaller percentages. And, the thinking, this is a little bit unscientific, but increasingly scientific, is that all these other minor cannabinoids are actually responsible for different effects that you're feeling in the high. It mellows you out or makes you gets you a little giggly or excited or hungry. Whereas with a lot of gummies, although this is changing, they're really just taking out the THC, the chief component responsible, putting it into a gelatin mixture, a chocolate, whatever it may be, and you're just getting the THC, and then that feels a little bit different. It's not exactly how humans have been consuming cannabis for centuries. It's a very different effect. Although now you're seeing, some of this is marketing and some of this is truly scientific. You're seeing a lot more companies develop ways to put all these other cannabinoids into gummies themselves with the THC and then market it based on those effects. So, maybe they'll say that they're adding CBN, which is thought to help you sleep. So there'll be a gummy with a few milligrams of THC, a few milligrams of CBN, and it'll be marketed for sleep, right? Again, the evidence is certainly pretty anecdotal in a lot of ways. The FDA is not saying that this is a sleep medication, but, I can tell you that when I take a CBN gummy, I do sleep better. And so that thinking is changing. But yes, it's absolutely different in the way the product is created, all the other chemicals around it, as well as how it's metabolized by.
What's next for Cultivated Media?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we're going to keep growing. We add new readers every single day. Look, I think, there's a lot of things we want to do, and especially when you are running a daily newsletter, there's a lot of things that would be nice to do, not a lot of things that you need to do, right? And so I think to answer the question succinctly, like, we want to write a great newsletter every single day. That means I'm reporting, I'm writing, I'm calling around to people trying to get the pulse of what's going on in the industry. But we certainly want to expand. We want to develop a more robust muscle to do investigative work about the companies and policies that are changing this industry so rapidly before our eyes. So that, we would love to be able to, hire more full-time writers. And eventually, I think we would expand into subscriptions, although we don't have that on the calendar right now. I think the next logical step for our business model is to expand the subscriptions and make sure that professionals that want the best information possible about the cannabis industry can access it through our platform.
Jeremy Berke, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Making Sense with Carl. To our listeners, thank you. Stay tuned for more great conversations on Making Sense with Carl. See you soon.